It's 7 o'clock. I'm Mark Austin with a Sky News special programme as the last US and UK troops head home from Afghanistan. Coming up, the Taliban on the march as coalition forces leave, an exclusive report with the militants trying to take control.
This is a crucial highway which the Taliban have been trying to get control of. But the fact that the Taliban have got so close to the capital is showing them they're making gains.
We're also with the National Army and the militias now trying to stop history repeating itself with very little Western help.
They're going to fight for democracy as we speak today. They're going to fight for the rights of the people. They're going to fight for the rights of women.
The ultimate sacrifice, the British troops who gave their lives fighting a 20-year war. And the big question, was it really worth it? Also, the Ministry of Defence works to prevent withdrawal becoming a disaster, and a former MI6 chief says the West could be making a terrible mistake. Also, the future for women fighting to hold on to their basic rights to go to school, to get a job, and to live their lives. Good evening. It wasn't meant to be like this. After 2 decades of conflict costing trillions of pounds and thousands of deaths, NATO forces are slipping quietly out of Afghanistan. No fanfare, no ceremony, and certainly no great claims of mission accomplished. There have been achievements. Al-Qaeda has been largely defeated. 3 million girls are back in education, and the National Army in Afghanistan is better equipped and trained. But, and here's the thing, the Taliban is resurgent, taking new territory with every passing week, and it is threatening to return to power with its harsh brand of Islamic justice, repression of women and girls, and its recent history of harbouring terrorists. In this special programme, I'll be speaking to the Taliban leadership. We look at the risks ahead, and we also look back at the awful cost in lives. Afghan lives, of course, but also many British and American ones. And we hear from a top British general who led forces in Afghanistan about what has been achieved and where and why the West has failed. But first this evening, our special correspondent Alex Crawford has been with the Taliban as they make their advance across the country. Here is her exclusive report.
The Taliban are on the march and gaining territory at an astonishing rate. We've been invited to meet them inside their own base. They want to show us, as foreign journalists, how strong they are, and also how they're in no mood to compromise. The departure of the bulk of the American and other NATO forces has emboldened them, and they smell victory. One commander in Wardak province told me they would never work alongside the other groups in government.
As a real Afghan, we would never do that because they are the people who are killing and kidnapping, who are thieves and who are corrupt, so we'll never work with them.
We're the first foreign journalists to see the latest army base the Taliban have captured in the province, and they want to show us the treasure trove of military riches they've seized with it. Many of these boxes supplied by the Americans hadn't even been opened before the Taliban got hold of them.
RPG.
Whoa. Can anyone believe that the Taliban wants peace when you've got all these weapons now?
Most of
the time we don't rely on all of this, we just rely on Allah. But it does help us a lot, and it's given us a lot of new weapons we can use in battle. Of course we want peace. All people want peace here, but the government doesn't want peace with us.
From this base alone, the Taliban say they seized about 900 guns, 30 Humvees and 20 army pickup trucks.
It's a whole pile of destroyed vehicles, military vehicles there, and a huge area that they've managed to take over. I think the Taliban will see this and view this as a substantial victory.
And it follows a nationwide pattern of Afghan soldiers putting up only a half-hearted fight. Many of the fighters we saw were carrying new weapons seized during the taking of the base. The white flag that signifies the Taliban takeover is flying in large swathes of the country right now, and they're creeping closer to the capital. Our journey en route to the Taliban was halted.
This is a crucial highway which the Taliban have been trying to get control of.
The Afghan army brought in reinforcements to push them back.
But the fact that the Taliban have got so close to the capital is showing them they're making gains.
The Taliban are winning the propaganda war, able to plant and detonate roadside bombs with few reassurances from the government about how they're going to regain control. Instead, in Taliban-controlled areas, they blame the Afghan National Army for injuries and insecurity. We saw no women at all out in public, although the Taliban insist they've progressed and want their girls educated.
Do you all welcome the Taliban being here? Tell me why.
Because it's so much safer now. The Taliban have brought us security and peace, he says. The Taliban paint themselves as deeply religious and say they're fighting for an Islamic emirate based on a strict interpretation of Sharia law. Like so many others, this former prisoner jailed by the Americans immediately rejoined the fight on his release.
The only thing that will persuade me to put down my gun is if there's Islamic law here, based entirely on Islam, and the government is run according to Islamic rules.
The Taliban resurgence appears to have real momentum, and that's worrying for the Afghan government and its international allies, who are now watching all the military hardware they handed over ending up in the hands of the group they're meant to be used against. The government is seen as weak and deeply unpopular in areas, particularly where the Taliban have managed to take a hold.
Can you work with any of them?
They are nothing, anything. They are nothing. And this, we will destroy them. We are going to destroy our country. They come, they bring bad situation for Afghanistan, for our people, for our civil lives, for our country, for our schools, for our hospitals, everything. They're destroyed.
And this while peace talks are meant to be ongoing. And all the while, the Taliban seem to be growing stronger, and that will surely lessen their desire to do any deals.
And Alex joins us live now from Kabul. Good evening, Alex. And Afghanistan traditionally is full of militias run by warlords. Are they also taking up the fight against the Taliban?
Well, certainly there's a great deal of worry amongst ordinary Afghan civilians about who is going to take on the Taliban now that the international troops have left the country, or all but left the country. They're hearing every day about the Afghan National Army ceding territory to the Taliban, sometimes giving up their bases and moving out without even a fight or a half-hearted fight. The Taliban are taking part in peace negotiations, but they are clearly extremely confident right now, and they are playing a very, very strong hand. I heard from a senior Taliban source who wouldn't be named that they're hoping to retake their birthplace of Kandahar by Eid, which is July 19th. They're talking about coming up with their own peace plan, possibly as early as next week, and that could involve them taking control of certain parts of the country. The obvious option is the south, their stronghold. Now that is deeply concerning and very, very worrying for all those civilians who do not want to see a return to the Taliban regime, who do not want them to see them taking any control whatsoever. And there have been calls for a national mobilization of these armed militia to take on the Taliban. The Afghan army is now all that stands between every town and the Taliban.
The soldiers who've relied so much on international training, air support and weaponry are now being left to tackle the Taliban insurgency on their own.
Every time that they leave their barracks, they know that they are the focus of any attacks by the Taliban, because the Taliban want to show that they're coming back into power and it's only a matter of time before they take over.
The Taliban's already moved into dozens of districts across the country, and they're circling the capital. Roadblocks are set up to try to secure the perimeter. But the weapons on the streets indicate just how insecure Afghanis are about their own safety. The uncertainty is palpable, and there's a great deal of tension everywhere. The Afghan soldiers fear they're now fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, thought to already be embedded within the Taliban. And the scramble by international troops to get out of Afghanistan appears to have empowered their enemies, who've had some rapid successes on the ground.
There's an awful lot of land that they have got to try and get back from the Taliban. And without those international troops, they have got their work cut out for them.
But the civilians are growing more nervous, with reports of soldiers surrendering and bases routed. But every soldier we spoke to is putting up a brave front. The Taliban tried to disrupt by laying mines, he told us, but we use our technical teams to find them before they explode. But that confidence in the ability to take on the Taliban isn't matched elsewhere. The rocky terrain of northern Afghanistan is home to the country's most formidable fighting partnership, different fighters known as Mujahideen who joined forces to form the Northern Alliance. The relics remain in the Panjshir Valley of how they beat back superpowers like the Soviet Union and kept the Taliban at bay. Ahmad Massoud, the son of the man who led them to those victories, is now stepping up to stop this new Taliban takeover. We were given rare access as his convoy of SUVs and armoured vehicles crisscrossed the region, often at high speed. There's a feeling there's no time to lose, with the Taliban trouncing areas in the north. But the security force with him is devoted to him and his cause.
If Taliban not accept peace, we will fight with them.
Okay. You're ready for this?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
100%.
Yeah.
Massoud was only 12 when his father was assassinated 2 days before 9/11. The young man, educated in London, has enormous support here. When he talks, they listen. And the crowds in his home region are looking to him to lead them in the new fight against extremism. The young Massoud insists the National Army needs help. And without international troop support, the Mujahideen are the only fighters who can give it. He says there are thousands like these men, armed and ready to beat back the Taliban and their extremist allies.
They're going to fight for democracy as we speak today. They're going to fight for the rights of the people. They're going to fight for the rights of women. And they're going to fight for many other values that we cherished and we loved and we achieved in the past 2-3 decades. So these are the things that they're ready to defend.
The preparations for battle come amid predictions that the Afghan government's heading for a swift collapse, prompting a fresh migration crisis and increased ISIS attacks.
We are the first line of defense. We are defending Europe, we are defending the region, and Afghans are fighting not just for themselves, but for everyone.
But former President Hamid Karzai urged Afghans to all lay down their guns and saved his strongest criticism for America.
The West must explain to us the presence of Daesh in Afghanistan. It emerged during the US presence in Afghanistan in the name of fight against extremism and terrorism. So they have failed.
America may dream this is the end of its longest war, but those arming themselves now, ready for more battles, fear it is far from done.
Let's go back to Alex Crawford in Kabul. And Alex, there are reports tonight that the Taliban is saying they'll present a peace proposal maybe by next month. I mean, could there be a sort of multi-party negotiated settlement?
I mean, clearly that's the hope. Everyone wants some sort of settlement and some sort of agreement. Certainly, I think, based on the Taliban fighters that I saw in Wardak province, they are in no mood to compromise. They can't see themselves sharing government or sharing power with any of these groups, particularly, let's take for a start, Ashraf Ghani's government at the moment, who they perceive as weak and corrupt and part of the problem. They definitely do not feel that they can offer out a hand of friendship to other warlords and other militia groups. So that's not likely to happen either. So very difficult to see what the future holds. And certainly, if you look at US intelligence reports, for instance, they're predicting a collapse of the current government, possibly within months, maybe sooner than that, maybe within weeks. So the future does not look very rosy at all for Afghanistan. However, there are a lot of factors at play which they will use as a carrot and stick to try and make all these groups come together. Former President Hamid Karzai, for one, is one of those people who are spearheading, trying to get these groups to come together, trying to persuade everyone that it is in no one's interest, definitely not Afghanistan's, for Afghans to be fighting Afghans. But he is furious about the emergence of ISIS here in this country, and you heard from Ahmed Massoud and others we've spoken to warning about the dire consequences, not just to the region but to the world, about what is likely to happen with this power vacuum and how it is in the international community's best interest to try and really put all their efforts into trying to resolve what's happening in Afghanistan here before it emerges into a massive humanitarian crisis, another migration crisis, an economic collapse, more ISIS attacks, which won't just be contained to this area. They'll blossom out and spread like the COVID virus all around the world.
Alex, for now, thanks very much. We'll be back with you before the end of the hour. Let's just give this some context and look at the origins of the war and some of the major developments over the past 20 years, 2 decades in which Afghan civilians have suffered huge losses of life, while the Afghan government keeps the army's death toll secret to avoid damaging morale. Estimates show that between 66 and 69,000 Afghan soldiers have also been killed, and the war has now cost an approximate $2.25 trillion. And in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration issued an ultimatum to the Taliban to give up the al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. That was rejected, leading to Operation Enduring Freedom, which began in October of that year. The Taliban controlled the majority of the country, save an enclave held by the Northern Alliance. The Taliban administration had collapsed by December. Hamid Karzai, the future president that Alex was talking about there, was sworn in as interim leader. The number of coalition forces on the ground, relatively small then, but there had already been 12 fatalities. Then in May 2003, George Bush declared an end to major combat operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Coalition forces had grown to 18,100 and there had been 140 deaths of coalition military personnel. Then for 8 years, coalition forces fought against a bloody insurgency. It was not until May 2011 that Osama bin Laden, the ostensible reason for the war, was killed by US forces in Pakistan. Coalition forces had ballooned in number by then to 131,300, as had the number of coalition deaths. They went up to 2,837. This marked the start of a gradual drift of the war from public gaze. In October 2014, British troops ended their combat operations. Coalition forces had shrunk to 44,500, but the number killed had continued to rise, with ISIS now operating in Afghanistan as well. By 2018, Donald Trump was president, having promised an end to what he was calling America's forever wars. The Taliban had begun to recover much of their lost territory following a halving of coalition forces and a stabilisation of the military deaths that reflected more modest ambitions on the ground. In February 2020, Donald Trump signed a peace deal with the Taliban without the approval of the Afghan government, but the year was marked by more violent attacks, including a mass shooting in a maternity hospital. With the withdrawal virtually complete, the Taliban are now estimated to control or contest over 3/4 of Afghan districts. Fewer than 10,000 coalition forces were deployed in this endgame to the conflict, a conflict that's claimed over 75,000 civilian lives and more than 3,500 military ones. Now, of those lives lost, 455 were British military personnel. At one stage of the war, it became a grim weekly ritual to hear the Prime Minister of the day read out the names of those killed, and the quiet Wiltshire town of Wootton Bassett became the centre of public grief over the cost of the war as the funeral cortege of the dead passed through. A recent study said that British soldiers were twice as likely to be killed as US troops, mainly because they were patrolling in highly dangerous Helmand province. James Matthews reports now on a snapshot of the sacrifice the UK armed forces have made in this war.
Leaving Afghanistan doesn't mean Afghanistan leaves them. Soldiers who served, like Stuart Pearson.
Not really.
And families who waited back home, like Bob and Jem Wright, the parents of Mark.
I used to say, well, if you go out and there's any trouble, hide behind the biggest tree. He went, I'm in Afghanistan, Mum. There's no any big trees.
We've got a man down!
Mark and Stuart's horrific story has been graphically depicted on the big screen.
Moving impossible due to location being minefield.
With colleagues, the two friends became trapped in a minefield after going in to help a fellow soldier who'd stood on a mine. Of 4 explosions, the second took off Stuart's left leg.
I took my foot off a rock, my left foot, and put it on the ground, and that's when I heard the explosion. I get blown up slightly and twisted round.
The soldiers had called for a helicopter with a winch to lift out casualties in relative safety, but they were told none was available. The downdraft from a landing Chinook set off another mine.
Unfortunately, Mark, who was straddling over me, protecting me from the downblast of the helicopter, he got blasted by that, injuries to his face, neck and upper body.
Mark Wright survived the first explosion that caught him. He was badly injured, but continued to communicate on the radio and with critically injured colleagues.
I remember just lying there thinking, I don't know if I can hold on for another hour here. But Mark wasn't. I was wanting to fall asleep, but Mark wouldn't let anyone fall asleep. He was shouting at us.
After 4 hours, US Black Hawk helicopters arrived at the site near Afghanistan's Kajaki Dam and winched the casualties to safety. 4 mines had injured 8 soldiers. Mark Wright was hit twice.
As Mark was getting winched up by the Black Hawks, he then shouted down, "Tell Jolene and my family that I love them."
Every night when he was wee before he went to sleep, I always said, I love you. I always thought if I'm dead in the morning, that was the last words he heard. And I mean, when he used to phone, he always says, bye, I love you.
I thought, oh, God, thank Christ, that's over. Then I looked beside me and Mark was lying there, and I looked again and paramedics were rolling on top of him, giving him CPR. And then I looked again at him and he was gone.
Just took the breath away. I just thought, that's our life over.
At the inquest into Mark Wright's death, the coroner called him an exceptional soldier whose death was down to a series of failures. A lack of appropriate UK helicopters with a winch, the downdraft from the Chinook, and the delay in sending an appropriate helicopter.
I'd say a lot of these decisions are just made by people with suits in Whitehall that have never fought a battle at all, taken one day and fought an enemy. So quite disgusted by it. Yeah.
Why did they go there in the first place? Everywhere they go, they never seem to finish a job, and that's them pulling out. What about these lives that were lost? It's sad.
James Matthews, Sky News, Dalkeith.
Well, to the west, the Taliban remains an extremist group whose history is littered with executions, assassinations, the subjugation of women and the harbouring of international terrorists. That's the way it was in the late 90s when they took control. I visited Kabul at the time and witnessed the repression and the fear of ordinary Afghans. The Taliban says things have changed. It claims to be taking territory by consent and has been involved in negotiations over the future of the country. But has it altered its hardline stance? Has it really changed? I spoke to the Taliban negotiator and spokesman Suhail Shaheen in Doha, and I asked him, after recent military gains, how much of the country it now controls.
In some districts, the Kabul administration, they initiate offensive against us, and we have to react to their offensives. Yes, there is some fighting, but not in all districts which have fallen to us.
Now, what the world is worried about is that the last time you were in power in 1996, it began, I was there in Kabul and I saw what you did. You imposed this harsh brand of Sharia law and justice. I saw your opponents hanging from lampposts. You had public executions. Will you be doing the same again?
You said about this lamppost and those hanging our opponents.
Yes, I saw I saw President Najibullah hanging from a lamppost. You were hanging your political opponents from lampposts.
Yes, that was in a situation when the Kabul city was taken. And after that, we had a government and there was a system of law courts, judiciary there, and everyone had the right of defense.
Right.
Even now, we have judiciary system better than that which is prevalent in Kabul administration.
OK, now you also banned girls from going to school. You banned girls and women from working. You banned girls and women from leaving home without a male chaperone. You banned them from showing skin in public. You banned them from taking senior jobs or going into politics and even speaking publicly. If you take power, will you do the same again?
These are some of the stories of the media. These are some of the points of propaganda. You just repeated those propaganda of our opponents, of our hostile forces.
But girls couldn't go to school. But girls couldn't go to school, could they? And now there are 3.3 million girls at school. There are women in politics, in law, in medicine. There are journalists, women who are in business owners, police officers. Are you telling them, those women, that they will not be able to do that in future if you are in control?
I have not said that. What I am saying that women have right to have access to education and to work. This we have said in Afghan conference here in Doha and another countries that we had in Moscow.
Right, and last time you harboured Osama bin Laden, protected him. You harboured al-Qaeda terrorists. A UN report says there are up to 500 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan now. The fear is that you will allow Afghanistan to become another launch pad for terrorism.
That is not true. I do not agree with that.
Which bit is not true?
All this 5,000 and this launching pad, not true, because we have this agreement of Doha agreement. We have commitment that we will not allow anyone or any entity to use the soil of Afghanistan against the United States, its allies in other countries.
Right. What is the most likely outcome for Afghanistan? Is it a negotiated political deal, a full Taliban takeover, or, as many think, another endless civil war?
I think it is a negotiated settlement for Afghanistan. I see it. There should be negotiated settlement for the country, because only in that case we can have a durable peace.
It is our policy. Military approach will bring victory, but not a durable peace.
It's a member of the Taliban leadership speaking to me earlier. Well, the war was fought not primarily to remove the Taliban from power, but rather to ensure that the country could not act as a haven for terror training camps and the leaders of al-Qaeda. But as US and UK forces withdraw, the former head of MI6, Alex Younger, has warned that it could well mean the resurgence of al-Qaeda and an increased terror threat to the UK. Our Foreign Affairs editor, Deborah Haynes, is outside the Ministry of Defence in London. Good evening, Deborah. And do I detect a certain amount of frustration, even anger on the British side about the way this is ending?
Well, there's no doubt that the UK did not support the US decision to call time on this conflict before there is any real semblance of stability on the ground. But I thought the comments from Sir Alex Younger were particularly interesting and significant. His main message was that it would be an enormous mistake, in his words, for the West to turn their back on Afghanistan in the way that they did back in 1989. And that year is significant because in February of that year, it was when the then Soviet Union withdrew its forces from Afghanistan. The West turned its back, the Taliban rose to power, and like you were discussing with that Taliban official just then, the country was then became a haven for al-Qaeda. And when the UK and the US went in there, they found an infrastructure to conduct terrorism that they could never have imagined before they went in. And that is the concern that, once again, with forces withdrawing, some kind of terrorist network could be allowed to thrive. And let's listen to what Sir Alex said specifically about that threat.
The reality is that there are groups there. We've been very successful in disrupting both Daesh and al-Qaeda. They're on the back foot, but it would be wrong patently to claim that they have gone away. And they have the capacity to regenerate. If terrorist groups are allowed to regenerate somewhere like Afghanistan, it will lead to more threat on the shores of our country and our allies.
We were told that the Prime Minister was set to chair a National Security Council meeting today. These meetings are held in secrecy. We're not briefed about them beforehand or after, so we don't know if it's actually taken place. But I can tell you that when I was walking down Whitehall just now, I did see the Defence Secretary coming out of the Cabinet Office building. I also saw the National Security Advisor emerging. They wouldn't talk to me, so I don't know why they were there. So maybe that meeting has happened, maybe not. But we did hear from Ben Wallace earlier in the House of Commons when he also raised concerns about the future threat potentially coming from Afghanistan.
We will continue to work with the Afghan government. We continue to focus on the threats that emanate from Afghanistan and may grow to emanate towards the United Kingdom and our allies, and we will do whatever we can. However, it is important in forward presence that we are always in those countries at the consent of the countries. There was a Doha agreement, there was a peace agreement.
We do believe that at some point this week we're going to get clarity from the UK government about their future footprint in Afghanistan. We think that that will involve the UK embassy, potentially a small number of regular troops, potentially special forces as well, though that will never be officially confirmed. OK,
Deborah, thank you very much indeed. Well, when President George W. Bush announced the US invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, the aims he set out were pretty clear: disrupt terrorist networks, bring those responsible for terror acts to justice and cut the military capability of the Taliban. 20 years on, Osama bin Laden is dead and no major terror attacks have been launched from Afghanistan against the West since. But as we've seen, the Taliban are very far from being a spent force. Our diplomatic editor, Dominic Waghorn, has been looking at whether coalition forces leave Afghanistan with, in any sense, mission accomplished.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Airstrikes and a promise from a president to use force with deliberate purpose.
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations.
The Allies' military aims in Afghanistan were at first clearly prescribed: destroy al-Qaeda and render the Taliban unable to help it.
The military action we are taking will be targeted against places we know to be involved in the al-Qaeda network of terror or against the military apparatus of the Taliban.
But then the mission morphed, expanding into what sounded like nation building.
We know that true peace will only be achieved when we give the Afghan people the means to achieve their own aspirations.
Whatever that meant, the Allies would spend another 2 decades and $2 trillion trying to achieve it. John Negroponte was US ambassador to the UN at the time.
Having clearly defined objectives before you enter into a conflict, I think always carries with it substantial risks.
But in terms of what happened in Afghanistan, was it a mistake to take on nation building, to expand that mission outwards?
It certainly was a risky proposition, and you could call it a mistake.
But it wasn't just mission creep. A huge distraction was coming that would undo the chances of success. General Sir Robert Fry commanded the Royal Marines in Afghanistan.
I think there was an opportunity, fleeting and squandered, but there was an opportunity which, had it been properly exploited, could have perhaps have created a lasting solution, or if that was too much to hope, at least given the Afghans themselves a fighting chance to sort themselves out. The reason it went wrong was Iraq.
Of the Labour cabinet who voted for military action in 2001, only one would talk about it now. Claire Short, unsparing in her assessment of the West's achievement in the decades that followed.
It's a failure. I mean, it's a terrible cost in human life and masses of money spent that hasn't brought a beneficial outcome for the people of Afghanistan. And it's a humiliation for NATO. I mean, it really is. The Taliban beat NATO.
More than 450 British lives have been lost in Afghanistan. More than 2,000 American. Tens of thousands of Afghan civilians have died. The cost has been put at something over $2.25 trillion. If, as seems more than possible, the Taliban can now sweep back to power, what was all that sacrifice for? Afghan forces must rely on themselves now and their training. The true test has yet to come. If they fail to hold back the Taliban, the West's adventure in Afghanistan is doomed to spectacular and costly failure. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Well, I'm joined now by General Sir David Richards, now Lord Richards, the former Chief of the Defence Staff, who also led NATO forces in southern Afghanistan and knows all there is to know about this country. So, Sir David, I mean, international troops have gone. Already the Taliban are marching across the north, capturing district after district, and many Afghan troops I see are fleeing. I mean, how would you describe the future for Afghanistan?
Well, I think there is a huge risk that we will soon have a proper civil war in Afghanistan. Some of our war aims have been achieved, most notably that to do with terrorism and its export, but that even will become vulnerable as this develops and ungoverned zones almost certainly start springing up, which we can't get at and which the rump of the Afghan government won't get at. So a pretty sorry tale of British and Western and American grand strategy gone badly wrong, I'm afraid.
So if that is the future, then the West may be seen to have failed. Where do you think it did go wrong?
Well, look, let me just say, first of all, it needn't yet fail. Not entirely anyway. Bits, I'm afraid, will not have been achieved, and that'll be to our shame, really, because of the moral factors that, were at the heart of some of this, and which we will have failed in and let down the Afghan people. We made big promises to them. But actually, what I want to see now, and I'll quickly come back to your question, is a coherent plan that salvages whatever can be salvaged from this situation. And I don't think it's too late But what I hear is a lot of sort of rather pious wording. What we need is a coherent, dynamic, well-resourced, financially a well-resourced plan that, as your excellent correspondent said, combines carrot and stick in a way that will still persuade the Taliban that they have to conform to some standards.
But could that have happened, 10 to 15 years ago? Were we fighting a very expensive war, clearly, in Iraq? Was that the wrong war? I mean, should we have been concentrating resources and focusing attention on Afghanistan?
Yes, the Americans took on too much. Rather buoyed up by their success in Afghanistan, they turned their attention to Iraq, realized they'd bitten off more than they could chew. NATO, and that's when I went out to command the NATO expansion across the country in 2006, rather reluctantly agreed to take on some of the responsibility from the Americans. The Americans then focused on Iraq and rather left Afghanistan to NATO. And I'm afraid NATO and European nations in particular just weren't up to the challenge, either in terms of their financial resource or indeed the amount of military activity they were prepared to put into it. I have to say, the Americans, to be fair, when you went to America in that period, one felt they were at war. You saw soldiers, traveling free on aircraft and, being sort of almost worshipped by the population. In Britain, I never got that impression, nor indeed, obviously, in the rest of Europe. We were sort of in a conflict, but we weren't full-bloodedly in Afghanistan the way the Americans tried but couldn't manage.
It's the Americans clearly intent on leaving now. I mean, is there any sense in which the British could stay on their own with maybe other NATO forces minus the Americans? Is that remotely feasible?
Well, I don't think it is, because we haven't got the stomach, nor, I fear now, the capacity to do it. It's not actually a huge number of troops. The Americans were considering leaving about 3,500. Combination of special forces, but not many, and then a rump, particularly of air capability, to ensure that the Afghan forces could continue to contain the Taliban and preserve security in the key cities, out of which we might slowly build economically in the way that was originally intended. But we talk a lot about defence cuts and thinking about the future and clever stuff that we're going to get. The fact is, this is today's war, and we can't really manage it in the way that we should be able to, and nor will other European nations step up to the mark. So I'm afraid that moment, if ever it existed, and certainly we could have done 10, 15 years ago if we'd wanted to, I'm afraid that moment is now gone. We depend on America.
OK, General Sir David Richards, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, the war has cost thousands of Afghan lives, and many believe that it could develop into a full-blown civil war again once Western forces have completely pulled out. Reconciliation may seem a distant dream for many people there, but is a descent into renewed chaos inevitable? Well, earlier we heard from Fawzia Kufi, a member of the Afghan government's peace negotiating team.
It's almost the same. Yes, things have changed. We have a government, institutions are there. There is security institutions, many progress on women's rights, etc. But if you look at the whole situation in terms of, still the risks for military extremism is there. The risk of institution, once again, being the victim of collapsing is there. The risk for, losing some of these gains are there.
I'm joined now by Fakunda Nadiri, a member of the Afghanistan High Council for National Reconciliation and a senior politician in Afghanistan. Thank you for being with us. So, women's rights and women's role in society have made some progress in the last 20 years. Do you fear that that will all be wasted if the Taliban regain control?
Indeed, if there is no guarantee and there is no assurance, then people talk about the reality of experiences. And we already know that the experience that we are talking about is not only about 20 years ago, but also about these 20 years that we have been passing through. That all brings us to the point to talk about the responsibilities of this new chapter in Afghanistan's, season.
The Taliban spokesman I spoke to a little earlier in this programme told me that the rights of women and the rights of girls would be protected where they're granted by Islam, he said. Do you believe him? Do you believe them? Do you have faith in them?
Well, you see, we are looking forward to see positive changes on behalf of Taliban's actions and rulings. We want to believe in actions, not in words. Right now, even in the districts that you already know that, systematically is collapsing under the rule of Taliban, we are not having very positive news from women's rights in those areas. So how can we trust further such kind of wordings? I think this is very important that you can ask Taliban to show such a kind of, claims that they make in your studio in the districts of Afghanistan right now, that some of them are under their control right now. In terms of the Islamic rights, it has to have a very clear notion of what they are talking about, because it can have various interpretations. And we know, and it's unfortunate that Taliban, in their previous ruling in Afghanistan, applied the most extreme interpretation of Sharia. And not only 20 years ago they did this, but even today, or during this 20 years, and right now, the districts that are under their control, women's rights are not practiced in a similar manner that they usually practice, that even a day before that the district was collapsed under the Taliban's ruling.
Fahunda, do you feel let down by the Americans and the international forces deciding to leave now?
Let me clarify this fact. As a responsible citizen of this country and as someone who is working in the political field, I have to talk about the realities. And I think after 20 years, the withdrawal of NATO and US troops does make sense. But I don't think that I should allow myself to even have issues with that. But our main concern is about the way that withdrawal is taking place. We want to have a responsible withdrawal from international troops, especially that, we have been thinking they have been building the country with us. They have been working on different fields with Afghans, from rebuilding our institutions to women's rights, to civil society, to the rule of law, and including, yes, our army. I'm afraid to say so far being responsible.
Okay, Fahunda, we're struggling with the connection, but you have made your point quite forcefully. Thanks very much indeed. And we were talking about it there, and images of Afghanistan are often dominated by, men with guns. But daily life in Afghanistan is full of people, often women and young people, who have carved out a life for themselves in spite of, or perhaps in defiance of, the threat of violence against them. But the threat of a return of Taliban dominance would heighten the risk for many. Finally, in this hour, we return to our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, who's been meeting the women fearing life under the Taliban.
Afghanistan's hospitals are filled with the war wounded, many of them children. The latest here is a 13-year-old girl. She's never known peace. And there's been a spike in casualties since the international troops have pulled out. Many who worked alongside the US troops are fleeing for their lives. Fatima, that's not her real name, and her children have gone into hiding after death threats from the Taliban for her work in empowering other women.
I feel extremely abandoned. I am in danger. It's not only that I am in danger, now my kids are in danger also.
I was given rare access to film inside a secret women's refuge. Every woman and child in here has run away or been rescued from abuse and violence, and they're terrified of the return of the Taliban.
Their worst fear is that they will disrespect them, they will use them, abuse them, or molest them, or whatever, and also they will kill them.
Here they don't believe the Taliban reassurances that they've changed. They tell me of forced marriages, of beatings and rapes where they have no say, and that's what they fear the Taliban will enforce. This 21-year-old told how she was being forced to marry a 13-year-old boy. I felt like my life was falling apart, she says, until I got here. Their fear of the Taliban is real and growing as the group gets stronger and snatches more territory. The young women of today's Afghanistan have had a glimpse of free thinking and independence. And their martial arts training combine the skills necessary in this country, how to survive bomb blasts and bullets. All but one has been caught up in terror incidents, many near their schools.
How scared are you about going to school?
I'm scared a lot. Whenever I leave my house, I'm scared, because we don't know if we'll come back alive, she says. 18-year-old Katera gets emotional, telling us she won't give up trying to be a lawyer. The explosions are normal to us now, she says. She's not afraid for herself, but she's terrified her family will be killed.
Have you lost anyone?
My cousin and uncle died in an explosion, she says. Almost everyone here has experienced death. Parts of Afghanistan are unrecognizable to Taliban times. Women owning and running their own businesses like this cafe. But they fear they'll be amongst the first to be banned by a Taliban regime.
I'm not feeling good because if they come back to Afghanistan, so we have lost all of these rights to go out or even go out of home.
I don't like a scarf, but I can like...
she has to wear a scarf.
If Taliban come, I have to wear a scarf. And it's awful for me.
Next door, there's another business owned and run by a woman. All this was taboo under the Taliban regime, and many fear it won't be long before those days are back again. The monuments to school children killed in terror explosions keep on increasing, with few optimistic about Afghanistan's immediate future.
And Alex joins us once again from Kabul. And Alex, you're there, you're on the ground. What is the most likely way that this unfolds in the coming months?
I mean, I think that is a pretty impossible question for anyone to answer right now, because there is so much uncertainty, there's so much insecurity. But I tell you what, there are the ingredients for chaos, all the ingredients for absolute anarchy. There are a number of different fighting groups. The Taliban itself is exceedingly well armed now. If you just take that one group in Wardak province that we were with, they had a huge base. I mean, hundreds of square kilometres stashed full of munitions, weapons, mortars, all brand new. All the sniper guns had been taken, all the military vehicles, about 50 had been taken. They are very, very well armed. They're obviously proving to be quite wily political manipulators as well, because they are holding all the cards right now. They're in no mood to negotiate, and even though they're talking peace, on the ground, there appears to be no evidence of actually wanting to collaborate with the Afghan government or any of the other players. And there's a great deal of uncertainty from all those other people who don't want a Taliban regime. There's a huge displacement of people. There are the ingredients for a humanitarian disaster. There is enormous uncertainty. And as I say, there are many people who are actually wanting to leave the country now. There are death threats against female journalists. There are death threats against female human rights defenders. There are death threats against interpreters and other people who worked with international troops. And there is generally a feeling, in many ways, although they didn't want international troops to stay in the country, they certainly didn't expect them to abandon them like this. The future, I'm afraid, looks pretty dire at the moment for those in Afghanistan. OK,
Alex, thanks very much indeed. And should be noted, the Taliban yet to take any of the major cities in Afghanistan. Well, that's it. That concludes our special programme tonight. The truth is, war has really been a way of life in Afghanistan for decades, centuries even. The hope was that this time America and Britain and their allies could change things for the better. In some ways, they have, as we've been hearing. But they leave behind a country facing yet more chaos, more uncertainty and more conflict. Sky News Tonight is coming next.